Now, welcome to our today's science lesson, that is Standard 8 Science, on plants, that is the parts of reproduction in flowering plants. Now, during our last discussion when you were introducing plants, we talked about reproduction, but now there we talked about reproduction, that is asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And I was clear, I said, with sexual reproduction, it includes fusion of different gametes from different parents. Either it may be flowers or in animals, different animals. Now we have female and male. Now with asexual, I said it's same parent, but now this same parent produces organisms which have same characteristics. Now today we are going to talk about reproduction in flowering plants, and first of all we must identify the flowering plant as the parts that deal with the reproduction is flower. On plant, the part that deals with the reproduction is a flower. Now when we are talking about a flower, we have to understand the parts of a flower first. Now for you to understand the parts of a flower, now you have to understand which parts is the female part of a flower and which one is the male part of a flower. Now this is a stigma, that is the upper part of the flower, that is the middle part of a flower. We have the stigma, which is on top. Then we have a style which supports the stigma. Then we have down there we have the ovary, and inside the ovary we have what we call the ovules. Now on the outer part of a flower we have the green like leaves, which are called the sepals. They are called the sepals or the calyx. Now the larger part that covers a flower, which is now it is colored, is called the sepal. It's called the petal. It's called the petal. And now this petal, the other name for the petal is also called the corolla. The other name of the petal is called the corolla. Now the corolla is the part that is colored. It may be yellow or blue or green. So any part of a flower that is colored is what we call the petal. The green part is the sepal. Then we have inside here we have the male part of a flower, which consists of now the anthers and the filament. Now direct to the functions of these parts. First of all you understand the parts, and then you understand the function of those parts. Now number one, we are going to discuss the part which is now called the stigma. What takes place in the stigma? At the stigma here is where now the pollen grain is received. The pollen grain is received at the stigma. Where does the pollen grain come? The pollen grain comes from the anthers to the stigma. Now, and still on this stigma, we have the germination of pollen tube. After it has received the pollen grain from the anthers, it is received by the stigma. Then at that stigma, we have germination of the pollen tube. Now, the second part is here, which is now the style. Now, the function of the style is just to support. It supports the stigma. It joins the stigma to the ovary. Therefore, this is the style. It joins the stigma to the ovary. And also, inside this style, we have the growth of the pollen tube. We have the growth of the pollen tube. I said in the stigma, we have germination of the pollen tube. Then we have growth of the pollen tube through the style. Now we move to the third part, which is the ovary. Now what's the ovary? The ovary, this one is the part that now contains the ovules. The ovary contains the ovule, that is, it's like a circular part of it which contains the ovary. Now the ovules are the female part of the flower. We are going to talk about them. That is now the female part of the flower is called the ovules. That is the female sex cells. Now if asked in exam, name the female sex cell. The female sex cells are called the ovules. Now what do they grow after fertilization? When fertilization takes place, the ovules grows into seeds. The ovules grows into seeds, while the ovary grows into a fruit. And this one we discussed during last time. The ovary grows into fruits, while the ovules grows into seeds. We move to the fifth part, which is now the anthers. The anthers, I've already said, it produces the pollen grain. And pollen grain is the male sex cells. Pollen grain is the male sex cell. Female sex cells are the ovules, while the male sex cells are the pollen grain. Now we move to the sixth part, which is now the filament. Now the filament, it's just a part that supports the anthers. It supports the anthers so that now the anthers can be raised from the bottom of the flower to the upper part. Now it's just a support. Now we move to the 7th part, which is now the petals. The petals, as I have said, is the colored part of the flower. Now this one, number one, it attracts the insects. We'll discuss under the flower cross pollination, and also in self-pollination we have those flowers that carry out pollination by use of insects. Now for insect to realize that this is a flower, the petals attracts it so that now the insect can fly from one point to another to get that pollen grain. Now when we move to this still, on the petals, they protect now the inner part of the flower. These anthers and the stigma, they are very delicate. So the petal, it encloses all the anthers, the stigma, and all the other parts of the flower. We move to the 8th part, which is the petal, the sepal. Now with the sepal, I said, is the green part of a flower. Now it protects, this one protects now the entire flower during the bud stage. We have a stage that's during the young stage, where now the flower is enclosed like that. This is a flower, all parts are enclosed before it opens up. This one is what we call the sepals. Now this sepals encloses this flower until it opens up so that now it can carry out fertilization. And that stage is what we call now the bud stage. We move to the 9th part of this flower. Now this part is called the pistil. Now when somebody asks you to give a name, general name that is used for the female part of a flower, you say the general name is the pistil. Now the pistil consists of some parts of a flower. This pistil consists of the style, it consists of the stigma, the ovary, and the ovules. Now in an exam they can ask you to give which one of the following is not part of the pistil. So you have to understand all the parts of the pistil, which is the female part of a flower. Now we move to the part which is called now the stamen. A stamen is the general name that is given to the male part of the flower. Male part of the flower. Stamen is a general name given to the male part of a flower. Now the male part of a flower consists of some parts, and these parts include the anthers, it includes the filament, and also it includes the pollen grain. Now the anthers produces pollen grain, and this filament, we said, it supports the anthers. We move to the other part, which is the nectary. Now mostly in the insect pollinated flowers, we have those nectars that are produced. Now the nectar is produced by what we call the nectary. Where does it located? Now at the base of this flower here, at the base of this flower, that's why you will get an insect. When it enters the flower, it goes until to the base of this flower. Now when it gets to the base, here we have the what we call the nectary. Now this nectary produces what we call the nectar. Now this nectar is what produces the smell that attracts more insects so that now they can carry out pollination. The other part we are going to discuss is the flower stalk. Now this flower stalk, as it's stated as stalk, it means is this part here which joins now the flower to the main plant. You get that now this is a plant. Now from the plant we have this flower growing here. Now this is what we call a stalk, and this is the plant. Now it attaches just a flower to the main plant. Now after understanding all the parts, after understanding the function of the parts, we have now to move to now what is happening so that now we can have fertilization. For fertilization to occur, we must have successful pollination. Now that one brings us to a subtopic on plants, which is now called pollination. Number one, you have to understand the definition of the term pollination, because you may be brought in an exam and they ask you the transfer of pollen grain from anthers to the stigma of a plant of a flower is called dash. A, pollination. B, self-pollination. C, cross-pollination. D, animal pollination. So you have to understand that if they stated transfer of pollen grain, that just from anthers to stigma of a flower. They have not added either the same flower or different flowers. You just said the answer becomes pollination. But now we have the types of pollination. We have the self-pollination and we have also the cross-pollination. Self-pollination, it means it is carried out on the same flower or on the same plant, but there's different flowers. But cross-pollination, it is with different flowers from different plants of the same kind. Now, when I come to number one, we are going to discuss self-pollination. I have said it's the transfer of pollen grain from anthers to stigma of same flowers. That is the first definition of self-pollination. Also, self-pollination can be defined as the transfer of pollen grain from anthers to stigma of one flower, from anthers of one flower to stigma of another flower of the same plant. For example, if we have this is a flower on this plant, this is a plant. Now this is a nice example I have here. This is a flower which they are on the same plants. Now we get that now the pollen grain is moves from the anthers of this flower to the next flower, or on the stigma of the next flower, but now it is the same plant. That is self-pollination. But now we have that self-pollination that occurs on the same flower. Just pollen grain from the anthers, it enters the stigma of the same flower. It's also called self-pollination. We move to cross-pollination. Now when we are talking about cross-pollination, you have to understand that this is now, it is crossing from one plant to another. But these plants are the same kind. It cannot occur maybe from a maize plant to a bean plant. That is not pollination. Pollination occurs either from one maize plant to another maize plant. That is now where you call cross-pollination. Now, as I said, the transfer of pollen grain from anthers of one flower to stigma of another flower, but on different plants of the same type stroke same kind. So if it is a maize plant, this is a maize plant, it's also this, it moves to another maize plant. That is cross-pollination. Now, but this pollination cannot occur without some agents. It cannot, in some flowers they develop their own means in which they carry out pollination, but most of the flowers they have to have the agents. So we are going also to discuss the agents of this pollination. What helps in pollination is what we call agents of pollination. Now, the pollination can occur either by help of animals, or it can occur by help of wind, or can occur by help of water. So you have those flowers that carry out pollination by animal. For example, animal can be birds, they can be mammals. Mammals, we are in mammals. We have insects, they can be insects, and under insect we can have bees and butterfly. And in most cases, you may get that pollination is carried out mostly by insects. For example, bees and butterflies, when they move from this plant, they suck the pollen grain, then they move to another plant, then they deposit that pollen grain, then that pollination occurs. Now we have that one that is carried out by wind. Now, by wind, we have that wind, we have those characteristics of flowers that are carried out pollination through wind pollination. Now, wind pollination occurs either one, the flower must have lighter pollen grain, so that when this wind blows, it carries out the pollen grain and deposits them to another plant. Now, it brings us to another agent, which is the water pollination. Water also carries out pollen grain from one plant to another plant. That is also an agent of pollination. So if you are asking an exam to give the agents of pollen grain, number one, you talk of an animal, you talk of wind, and you talk of water. Now, we have this question which is very common, to give the differences between an insect pollinated flower and a wind pollinated flower. Now when you are discussing about the wind pollinated flower, number one, they are dull colored, meaning their color is not bright. While the insect pollinated flower, they are brightly colored. They are brightly colored so that now they can attract the insects. Now they are dull because the wind is not attracted, it just blows from anywhere. Now number two, characteristics of insect pollinated flower, they are large in size. They are large in size. Now and wind pollinated, they are small in size. When you talk of insect pollinated flower, they produce nectar. This nectar is the one that now produces smell. We'll talk about the insect pollinated flowers they produce smell, which is also scented. They are scented. Now with wind pollinated flower, they do not produce nectar. Now, when we come about this, that is to produce smell, that the smell is produced from the nectar, which is produced by the nectary. Then this one, they lack smell, that is they do not have scent, they are not scented. We move to another characteristics of insect pollinated flower. We say they have small anthers, while the wind pollinated flowers, they have large anthers. Why do they have small anthers, and why do these ones have large anthers? They have large anthers so that now they can produce so many pollen grains. With these many pollen grains are carried by wind, most of them they are wasted and others are deposited to different plants, hence being large anthers. And these ones are small and very sticky. They are sticky because when the insect touches to the flower, it has to attach the pollen grain to the legs or to the mouth of the insect. Therefore the insect moves to another flower and they attach there. That carries out pollination. Then lastly, we say they produce fewer small pollen grain, while this one produce many large powdery pollen grain. Why do they? They are light because the wind blows, then they are carried away by wind. Then when they are small, because they are small because they are strictly carried by insect. When the insect touches them, they carry all of them and then they deposit exactly to the point they are needed. Now, this is all about the discussion of today, and this is all about the discussion on insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. So you must be strict to have the characteristics of insect pollinated flower, because now in an exam you may be given some characteristics, then they ask you which flower is this, or which agent of pollination helps in pollinating of the flower. So you must understand the characteristics of insect pollinated flower and those that are wind pollinated flower. And also in an exam you have to understand the flower, because you may be asked to name the part labeled A, name the part labeled B, and give the function of that part. So you have to understand the flower, the reproduction. In general, you have to understand the reproduction of flowering plants, the parts. You have to understand pollination, the types of pollination, and the characteristics of that pollination. And also you have to understand the agents of pollination, and finally understand the part that deals with now the insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flower. And that is all about today. Thank you very much.